The year is 1639. Japan has closed its gates to the outside world. The shogunate has spoken, and the seas are guarded. Ships from distant lands are turned away, save for a few allowed to anchor at Nagasaki under watchful eyes. The rest of the world drifts beyond the horizon, distant, unseen. Within these island shores, a new rhythm emerges, a country turned inward, a society watching itself more closely than ever before. The temples, the markets, the silent villages, and the great city of Edo all begin to breathe within the boundaries of this seclusion. And yet, life is not static. Behind the gates, the world is rich with quiet dramas, samurai in meditation, artisans shaping wood and silk, merchants tracing hidden paths, watchmen pacing through midnight streets.
This is not the story of great battles or foreign conquest. It is the story of stillness, of how a nation turned inward, and in doing so revealed its soul. Tonight we will wander those hidden alleys. We will sit among the monks in their gardens, hear the merchants bargain by lantern light, follow the watchmen through the hours before dawn. We will listen not to the thunder of history, but to the whispers that echo in its silence. This is Japan in the age of seclusion. This is Sakoku. The sea is the first sound. Before voices, before footsteps, before any trace of human work, it is always the sea. The waves push and fall, over and over, as if the islands breathe in a rhythm of their own. For centuries, the Japanese have lived in harmony with this constant sound. It is not only background noise, it is a heartbeat, a reminder of separation and of belonging. In the 17th century, the sea became something more than a border. It became a wall, a soft wall built not of stone or wood, but of policy, fear, and choice. Japan had known the wider world. Ships had sailed, missions had been sent abroad, foreigners had stepped ashore. But now, under the rule of the Tokugawa shoguns, that world was shut away. The ports were closed, save for a narrow channel through Nagasaki. And so the sea returned to its first role, a keeper of silence. This silence was not empty. It was filled with lives, with routines, with the turning of seasons and the passing of generations. It was filled with the creak of oars, the lowing of oxen in fields, the laughter of children on narrow paths, the chanting of monks at dawn, the crackle of wood fires, the ringing of bells. To understand this closed world, we must begin not with the laws or the rulers who enforced them, but with the land itself and the atmosphere of stillness that shaped the lives of those who called it home. Japan is a chain of islands, long and narrow, curving like a bow across the sea. To the north, cold winds sweep down from Siberia. To the south, warm breezes rise from the tropics. Mountains cover most of the land, their ridges cutting the country into pockets of valleys and plains. Rivers rush quickly from high slopes to the sea, feeding rice paddies that glitter like mirrors in the sunlight. The people lived in the spaces between these mountains, along rivers, beside coasts, in pockets of fertile soil. Villages grew where the earth was kindest, where water could be guided into fields, where fish could be caught, where wood could be gathered. The mountains were not empty. They were full of spirits, stories, and sacred places. Temples clung to slopes, shrines hid among cedars, hermits lived in caves. But for ordinary people, the mountains were also a border, hemming them in, enclosing them, shaping their sense of the world. When the Tokugawa shogunate closed Japan, it was not felt first in the high halls of power, but in these valleys and coasts. Most villagers had never seen a foreigner, nor sailed beyond their own shores. The closing was not a sudden shift, but a quiet deepening of what had always been. The sense that Japan was a self-contained world, complete in itself, surrounded by silence. Stillness does not mean nothing happens. It means that what happens moves slowly, predictably, in cycles that repeat. To live in Japan during this time was to live within patterns older than memory. The day began with the rooster's call, with a first faint light turning the mountains pale, with the sound of buckets being lowered into wells. Morning mist clung to the paddies. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Families stirred, farmers pulling on straw sandals, women tying their hair, children rubbing their eyes. There was no rush, no frantic start to the day. Life was steady, paced by necessity, by the needs of rice and soil, not by clocks or bells. The year unfolded in the same way. Spring meant planting, summer meant tending, autumn meant harvest, winter meant endurance. Festivals marked the turning of the seasons, not as entertainment, but as reassurance that life was moving as it should, that time had not slipped its order. This rhythm extended even to politics. The shogunate was careful, deliberate, slow to change. Laws were issued, but slowly. Roads were built, but carefully. The silence of the islands was not an accident, but a choice maintained with patience. One of the most striking features of this age was what was missing. For centuries before, Japan had known almost constant conflict. Warlords fought for territory, armies marched, villages burned. But under Tokugawa rule, that storm ended. The sword grew still. The absence of war was itself a kind of silence. Samurai who once defined themselves by battle now lived lives of study, administration, and ritual. Farmers no longer feared the sudden approach of troops. Roads were safer, markets more predictable. It was not peace in the sense of harmony. There were still disputes, taxes, hardships. But it was peace in the sense of stability, a long quiet stretching across generations, shaping the very sense of time. Children grew up never hearing battle drums. Grandparents told stories of wars past as if they belonged to another world. In this way, stillness became inherited, as natural as the air, as invisible as the sky. To call this era silent is not to say it was without sound. It is to say that the sounds were of a different kind. Instead of cannons, there were bells. Instead of shouting soldiers, chanting monks. Instead of gunfire, the sound of wood being split, of water flowing in channels, of footsteps on gravel paths. Silence was also woven into the culture. In the tea room, silence was part of the ritual, the pause before a sip, the quiet between words. In poetry, silence was suggested in what was left unsaid, the space around the image. In gardens, silence was the sound of wind through bamboo, the space left open around stones and sand. In this way, stillness was not only imposed by policy, it was cultivated, valued, even cherished. Yet the world outside remained, distant, unreachable, but faintly felt. Sailors told of foreign ships on the horizon. Rumors spread of lands where people spoke strange languages, where cities had towers of stone, where goods of unfamiliar shape and color existed. But for most people, these stories were like dreams, half believed, half dismissed. The shogunate's policies ensured that the outside world was not part of daily life. It was a whisper, an echo, not a presence. To live in Japan during this time was to live with an awareness of being apart. The islands were not part of the great currents of world trade, nor of the wars and revolutions that shook Europe. They were a world unto themselves. And so life settled into patterns of inward focus. The arts flourished, not in the exchange of ideas across borders, but in deepening what was already there. Poetry, painting, theater, gardening, all refined, all turned inward, all developed in the soil of silence. Silence can be heavy. It can feel like waiting. And in some ways, this entire era was a long wait. A wait without a clear end. A wait that stretched across generations. But waiting is not wasted time. It is a discipline. The Japanese learned to live within this waiting, finding beauty in the turning of the seasons, in the small perfection of daily tasks, in the rituals that framed life. A family planting rice was not simply working, they were participating in a cycle older than memory. A monk sweeping temple steps was not only cleaning, but maintaining a silence that had been tended for centuries. Even the fisherman casting his net into the sea was continuing a rhythm as constant as the tides. In this way, the stillness was not absence, it was presence. A presence of order, of continuity, of life lived not in haste, but in depth.
The Silent Islands. This is how Japan appeared in the 17th century, after it closed itself to the outside. Not lifeless, not empty, but filled with the quiet sounds of daily life, of rituals repeated, of seasons turning. The silence was not a void, it was a fabric woven from patience, duty, and the steady rhythm of earth and sea. To walk into this world is to slow one's step, to breathe in time with the waves, to listen not for what is loud, but for what is constant. And in that constancy, we begin to understand the life of a people who lived within silence and found in it not emptiness, but meaning. The morning in a Japanese village of the 17th century does not arrive suddenly. It unfolds. It seeps into the air, into the fields, into the wooden beams of the houses. The first sound is often the rooster, a rough, insistent call, cutting through the last of the night. Then comes the stirring of animals, the low grunt of a pig, the shuffle of chickens in their pen, the clatter of a cow's halter as it is lifted for the day. In these villages, animals are companions to labor, silent witnesses to the steady turning of the seasons. Smoke begins to curl from the thatched roofs. Women rise early, pulling aside sliding wooden doors to let in the pale gray of dawn. They crouch before the hearth, coaxing embers back into flame. The crackle of firewood joins the chorus of morning sounds. The splash of water from a wooden bucket, the cough of a child waking, the hushed murmur of greetings exchanged before work begins. This is the rhythm of the village morning, not rushed, not idle, simply steady. A Japanese village in the Tokugawa period was not large. Perhaps a few dozen homes, huddled along a narrow path, with patties stretching outward like glass. The houses are low, their roofs thick with straw, their walls made of wood and plaster. Outside, bundles of tools lean against doorways. Hoes, sickles, baskets woven from bamboo. The air is cool in the early hours. Mist lingers over the paddies, turning the water into mirrors of the sky. Mountains rise beyond, their slopes thick with cedar and pine. The village sits like a pocket of life, small and fragile
against the enormity of earth and forest. Yet, to those who live here, it is the center of the world. There is no hurry to leave this place. Few will ever travel far. The rhythm of life is bounded by the fields, the shrine, the river, and the road that leads to the nearest market town. Within this circle, every morning is familiar, and every task is known. The day begins, always, with rice. Rice is not simply food, it is survival, measure, and meaning. In the Tokugawa era, the wealth of a domain was calculated not in gold or silver, but in koku, a measure of how much rice it could produce. A single koku was enough to feed one man for a year. But in the village, rice is not numbers on a ledger. It is the plant that must be tended season by season. Every morning, men and women walk to the fields. In spring, they carry trays of seedlings, dipping their feet into the cool water, planting each stalk with careful rhythm. In summer, they wade among the paddies to pull weeds. In autumn, they cut the golden stalks and tie them into bundles, standing them upright to dry in the sun. The morning work is often done in silence, not because the villagers are solemn, but because the rhythm of labor requires little speech. The sound is of feet squelching in water, of sickles slicing through stems, of distant voices calling across the fields. Inside the home, while men move to the fields, women tend to the household. The hearth is the center, a clay-lined pit set into the floor, where wood burns slowly and smoke drifts upward through the thatch. On it rests an iron pot, in which rice steams, sending out a fragrance both sharp and soft. Breakfast is simple: rice, pickled vegetables, perhaps a bit of fish, if the river has been kind. For children, it is enough to fill the belly before school or work. For adults, it is fuel for the long hours in the fields. Meals are eaten together, often in silence, the sound of chopsticks clicking against bowls echoing softly in the wooden room. Children have their part in the morning rhythm. Some carry water from the well. In the Tokugawa era, childhood was brief. By the age of 7 or 8, most children were already contributing to the household's labor. But there is laughter, too. Children chasing one another between houses, splashing water at the well, drawing lines in the dirt with sticks. No village morning is complete without a sense of reverence. At the edge of the settlement, beneath a cluster of trees, there is almost always a shrine. It may be small, little more than a wooden box with a sloping roof set upon stone steps. Yet it carries the weight of centuries. Villagers stop here on their way to the fields. They bow, clap their hands softly, and leave offerings, perhaps a handful of rice, a sprig of greenery, a small coin. These gestures are not grand, not dramatic. They are woven into the morning as naturally as breathing. The gods, they believe, dwell in every stream and stone, in every breeze and flame. To greet them is to align oneself with the unseen order of the world. The sound of a shrine bell carries faintly across the fields. It is not loud. It does not need to be. It is simply a reminder. The day has begun, and it unfolds under watchful eyes. Every morning has its tools, simple and well-worn. A sickle, sharpened with care. A hoe, its wooden shaft polished smooth from years of use. A straw raincoat, woven from rushes, ready to be thrown over the shoulders when clouds gather. A pair of sandals, patched and repaired many times. These objects are not possessions in the modern sense. They are extensions of labor, companions in the cycle of survival. A farmer knows his hoe as he knows his own hands. A woman knows the pot in which she cooks as she knows the rhythms of her children's breath. Even repair is a ritual. Tools are mended again and again, their scars testifying to years of service. A cracked pot is patched with metal staples. A frayed rope is rewoven. Nothing is discarded lightly. Each object carries the memory of mornings past. If one were to close their eyes in a village morning, what would they hear? Not silence, not truly, but not clamor either. They would hear the creak of wooden wheels as a cart is pushed along the path, the rhythmic splash of water flowing into irrigation channels, the occasional bark of a dog, the crowing of roosters, the cry of cranes overhead, the soft shuffle of straw sandals on dirt roads, the distant ring of a bell from the temple. It is a music of small sounds, layered one atop another, without urgency. The soundscape of a morning that expects nothing sudden, nothing strange. A morning that repeats itself, not with monotony, but with reassurance. The village morning is not the same in every season. In spring it is damp and fragrant, with cherry blossoms drifting across the paddies. Children pluck petals from the ground and float them in the wells, laughing as they spin in circles. Farmers prepare seedlings, their hands sinking into the soft mud. In summer, mornings begin early, before the heat becomes heavy. The air is alive with cicadas, their song rising and falling like waves. Sweat gathers quickly on brows, and the shade of trees becomes a sanctuary. In autumn, mornings are golden. The fields shimmer with ripe rice, bending under their own weight. The smell of cut stalks fills the air, mingled with the smoke of burning chaff. There is a quiet satisfaction in autumn mornings, a sense that the year's labor has borne fruit. In winter, mornings are hard. Frost covers the roofs, breath comes out in clouds. Families huddle near the hearth, warming hands before facing the cold. Yet even in winter, the rhythm continues. Firewood to split, animals to tend, water to carry from frozen streams. Each season gives the morning a different face, yet the underlying rhythm remains the same. Work, prayer, meal, labor. Year after year, century after century. For us, looking back, the Tokugawa village morning might seem distant, unfamiliar. But for those who lived it, it was the very definition of normal. It was not a story. It was not remarkable. It was simply life. And yet, in its very ordinariness, lies its beauty. The same path walked every day, the same meal eaten, the same fields tended. This continuity was a comfort. It was also a discipline. To repeat the same motions day after day is to enter into a rhythm larger than oneself. In this sense, every village morning was both personal and communal. Each family had its tasks, but the village as a whole shared its rhythm. The ringing of one temple bell marked time for all. The rising of smoke from many hearths
created a single cloud above. The laughter of children echoed across many households, binding them together in sound.
As the sun climbs higher, the mist burns away. Shadows shorten. The paddies gleam under the sky. By now, the village is fully awake. The men are bent over their work. The women are tending to chores. The children have scattered, some to school, some to labor, some to play. The shrine has received its offerings, the temple, its morning chants. Morning does not end quickly. It stretches slowly, like a breath held long and deep. The villagers know that the day will be long, the tasks many, but they do not rush. To rush is to disturb the rhythm. To rush is to forget that each step, each motion, is part of a cycle that repeats endlessly. And so the village morning lingers. It lingers in the sound of sandals in the fields. It lingers in the sight of smoke rising from every roof. It lingers in the taste of rice on the tongue, in the feel of wooden tools against the palm. It lingers because it is not simply the start of the day. It is the foundation of life itself. This is the village morning. Not dramatic, not remarkable, but essential. A time when silence is filled with the sounds of labor, of family, of ritual. A time when the rhythms of earth and water dictate the motions of human life. A time that repeats endlessly across years and generations, binding the people of the archipelago into a shared stillness. The world beyond may rush forward with wars and inventions and revolutions, but here, in the quiet morning of a Japanese village, time moves as slowly as mist lifting from a paddy field. And so, with each dawn, life begins again. Not with urgency, but with steadiness, with patience, with silence that is never empty, but always alive. There was a time when the word samurai carried the sharpness of steel, when it meant war banners flapping against storm clouds, when it meant horses thundering across fields, swords drawn, arrows hissing through the air. But by the 17th century, in the age of Tokugawa peace, the clamor of battle had faded. The armor was polished, but rarely worn. The sword, once a tool of survival, now rested in silence more often than it flashed in combat. The samurai still walked the towns and cities of Japan, but they did so in a world that no longer needed their violence. This is their story, not of battlefields, but of stillness, not of conquest, but of waiting, not of fire, but of discipline lived in the quiet hours. When Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan at the start of the 17th century, he brought to an end the long chaos of the Sengoku period. For nearly a century before him, Japan had been torn by civil war, lords fighting lords, alliances made and broken, entire provinces reduced to ash. But under Tokugawa rule, the country was stabilized. The great lords were bound to the shogunate. The peasants returned to their fields, the villages rebuilt, and the samurai, once the heart of this endless warfare, suddenly found themselves without war. Yet the samurai could not simply vanish. They were too deeply embedded in the social order. Instead, their role was reshaped. They became administrators, officials, and teachers. The sword was still carried, but more as a symbol of class than as a tool of necessity. To be samurai in this age was to live a paradox, to be defined by combat and yet to never see combat, to carry weapons, and yet to rarely draw them, to be warriors in an age without war. Every samurai belonged to a domain ruled by a daimyo or lord. The daimyo lived in a castle, and around the castle stretched a town. These jokomachi, or castle towns, became the heart of Tokugawa society. In these towns, samurai resided according to rank. Higher retainers lived closer to the castle, in larger houses with tiled roofs. Lower-ranking samurai lived further out, in humbler dwellings, the walls thin, the floors bare, but all were bound to the same duty, to serve their lord in whatever way was required. In the early morning, a samurai might rise before the sun. He would slide open the paper screens of his home, letting in the pale light of dawn. He might kneel before the household altar, bowing his head in silence. His day was not one of dramatic action, but of routine. He might copy records, attend lessons, stand guard at a gate, or walk in procession behind his lord. The streets of a castle town reflected this order. They were laid out with care, divided by class. Merchants lived in one quarter, artisans in another, peasants outside the walls. The samurai, with their distinctive topknots and paired swords, walked these streets as visible symbols of authority. But their authority was exercised not in battle, but in presence. Simply to be samurai, to embody discipline, was itself a kind of service. The swords remained. Every samurai carried two, the long katana and the shorter wakizashi. Together they formed the daisho, the great and small, the visible mark of a warrior. But in these years of peace, the swords grew quiet. They were rarely drawn. Duels, once common, were discouraged. Violence outside of duty was punished harshly, and so the sword took on a new meaning. It became not only a weapon, but a symbol of restraint. To carry it, but not to use it. To know its power, but to keep it sheathed. This discipline was as much a part of samurai life as combat had once been. Some samurai practiced swordsmanship daily, cutting through straw targets, rehearsing forms with partners, moving in slow, precise patterns that echoed battles no longer fought. Others studied the philosophy of the sword, writing treatises on the unity of blade and spirit. The weapon was no longer only steel, it was a mirror of the self. As the sword grew still, the brush grew busy. Samurai were expected to be literate, to understand law, history, and administration. They copied records, managed taxes, studied Confucian philosophy, and trained in the art of writing. The brush and the sword were often described as equal halves of the samurai's duty, one to enforce, one to preserve, one to discipline the body, the other to discipline the mind. In the quiet hours of a castle town, one could hear the soft scratch of brushes on paper, characters flowing in black ink across scrolls, documents prepared with care, each stroke deliberate, each word chosen. For many samurai, this quiet labor became the shape of life itself. Discipline was also found in ritual. One of the most refined was the tea ceremony. In a small tatami room, often no more than a few steps across, samurai and guests would gather. The host would prepare tea with slow, deliberate motions, pouring water, whisking the green powder, offering the bowl with both hands. There was silence in this ritual. Not the silence of emptiness, but of presence. Every gesture mattered. Every pause carried meaning. In this stillness, samurai practiced the same patience they showed in their duties. Control of the self, awareness of the moment, respect for the order of things. The tea room was a space without weapons. Swords were left outside. Here, rank and title dissolved. All sat as equals, united by the quiet act of sharing tea. Not all samurai lived with ease. Many were of low rank, receiving stipends barely enough to live upon. In theory, the samurai were above farmers, artisans, and merchants, but in practice, many samurai lived poorer lives than those beneath them. Their stipends were fixed in rice, and inflation or mismanagement often left them struggling. Some took on side work as teachers, scribes, or even laborers. Others sold their swords or pawned their armor to make ends meet. And yet, despite hardship, they clung to their identity. To be samurai was not only a matter of wealth, but of honor. Even in poverty, they carried themselves with dignity. Even in want, they lived by discipline. This, too, was a kind of stillness, a patience in the face of hardship, a refusal to abandon the role, even when the role brought little comfort. Perhaps the most defining feature of samurai life in this era was waiting. Waiting for duty, waiting for the summons of their lord, waiting for days that might pass with little happening. A samurai might spend hours each day in readiness, standing guard at a gate where no enemy would come, copying records that few would ever read, rehearsing forms for battles that would never be fought. To us, such a life may seem empty, but to the samurai, it was discipline. It was the art of being prepared, of living always as if duty could call at any moment. This was their way of embodying loyalty, not in dramatic action, but in constant readiness. Stillness did not mean idleness. Many samurai turned to arts as expressions of discipline. Some wrote poetry, short, precise verses that captured fleeting moments. Others painted landscapes in ink, letting mountains and rivers emerge from brushstrokes of black and gray. Some tended gardens, arranging stones and moss, raking sand into patterns that echoed waves. These acts were not hobbies, but practices. Each carried the same spirit as swordsmanship, precision, patience, attention. To tend a garden was to discipline the mind. To write a poem was to refine the heart. To paint a mountain was to study silence itself. For children born into samurai families, this stillness was their inheritance. Boys were taught the forms of martial arts, even if they would never use them in combat. They learned to bow, to speak with restraint, to walk with dignity. Girls were taught to manage households, to practice etiquette, to embody quiet strength. The household itself reflected the same balance. Scrolls hung in alcoves, swords rested in stands, gardens stretched outside sliding doors. Silence filled the rooms, broken only by the sound of brush, of flute, of wind through bamboo. Generations passed in this way. Grandfathers who had once heard tales of war saw their grandchildren grow up in an age where war was only memory. The stillness lengthened, becoming not a pause, but a way of life. The samurai of Tokugawa, Japan, lived in silence, not the silence of defeat, nor of erasure, but of transformation. They remained warriors, yet their battles were inward. Their swords grew still, but their discipline deepened. They embodied waiting. They carried weapons they did not use. They studied. They wrote. They practiced rituals of patience. They endured poverty, hardship, and monotony with dignity. To be a samurai in this age was to live as a symbol of order, of restraint, of loyalty held steady through silence. And so they walked the streets of the castle towns, paired swords at their sides, steps measured, expressions calm. Warriors without war, guardians of stillness. The archipelago was silent, and within that silence, the samurai waited.
The term Ukiyo once carried a somber weight. In older Buddhist thought, it meant the sorrowful world, a place of impermanence, of suffering, of endless cycles of birth and death. But in Edo Japan, the word was given a softer, more shimmering shape. Here, Ukiyo meant the floating world, a realm of fleeting pleasures, gentle distractions, and artful diversions set apart from the quiet duties of village and farm. In the evenings when the shutters of the city were drawn back and the lanterns were lit, this world awakened. Its boundaries were not marked by walls or gates, but by the subtle shift of air and rhythm, where everyday concerns seemed to drift aside, replaced by a gentle hum of music, conversation, and painted light. Edo itself was a city of contrasts. By day it was crowded with merchants, officials, and messengers. The clatter of wooden carts filled the avenues and banners fluttered above shops that sold rice, silk, and lacquerware. But by night, the city seemed to loosen its shoulders. Lanterns swayed from doorways, their paper shades glowing softly like small moons. The river reflected them in trembling lines, as though the water itself wished to carry the city's pleasures downstream. Narrow alleys drew visitors toward tea houses, kabuki theaters, and the licensed quarters, where the floating world gathered its dreamers and seekers. The sound of a shamisen, 3 strings plucked with slow deliberation, marked the threshold. The tune was neither hurried nor urgent. It lingered, each note dissolving like mist. And for those who stepped within, it was as though the rigid order of the day had dissolved into something lighter, less certain, more like drifting. In Edo, the name Yoshiwara was whispered with a peculiar softness. It was a district set apart, both sanctioned and contained. A place where the floating world gathered in its fullest form. By day, the streets of Yoshiwara were quiet. Children might play in the dust. Shopkeepers might sweep their thresholds. But as the sun lowered, lamps were lit one by one, until the district shone like a constellation apart from the rest of the city. Visitors arrived in palanquins, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel paths. They passed under wooden gates painted in vermilion, entering a world not of necessity, but of artifice, where every gesture, every garment, every word was carefully shaped to appear effortless. Here, courtesans sat behind latticed windows, their hair arranged in elaborate knots, their robes of silk embroidered with blossoms, waves, and cranes. They were not hurried to speak or to beckon. Their stillness was part of the art, a reminder that beauty, too, is a form of waiting. The courtesan was not merely a figure of desire. She was expected to converse, to compose poems, to accompany a song on the shamisen. In her presence, a visitor might feel for a moment as though he had stepped into a painting, a fleeting world of patterns and voices, soon to dissolve like a dream upon waking. Not far from these lantern-lit streets, another stage awaited. Kabuki, the theater of Edo, was itself a floating world. Audiences gathered in wooden playhouses that smelled of pine and smoke. They removed their sandals and sat on mats, the air filled with the murmuring of neighbors and the rustling of paper fans. Above them, lamps hung in clusters, their light uneven but warm. When the curtain rose, the world shifted again. Actors appeared in bold robes, their faces painted with lines of red and black. They spoke in measured tones, their voices carrying to the rafters. Stories unfolded, not in haste, but in rhythm,
each gesture deliberate, each pause as meaningful as a word. For the common townsman, the kabuki stage was both a mirror and a dream. It reflected the struggles of merchants, lovers, and wanderers, yet elevated them into something larger, more graceful. When the actor froze in a dramatic pose, time itself seemed to pause, a reminder that beauty often lies in the suspension of motion. Beyond the theaters and pleasure houses, the floating world found another life, on paper. Woodblock prints, known as ukiyo-e, carried the scenes of Edo into homes far beyond Yoshiwara. A print might show a courtesan with her robes gathered like flowing water. Another might capture an actor frozen in his stage pose, or a sumo wrestler preparing to bow. And others still turned their gaze outward, toward the riverbanks, the bridges, the distant silhouette of Mount Fuji. The making of such prints was itself a floating world. The carver traced the artist's design onto cherrywood blocks, his knife moving slowly, each line deliberate. The printer applied pigments by hand, blues for water, reds for robes, soft grays for mist, pressing the paper against the block with steady pressure. When the paper was lifted, the world appeared in miniature, a scene caught between permanence and impermanence, endlessly repeatable, yet always fleeting. These prints traveled widely, carried by merchants, collected by townsfolk, sometimes even reaching distant lands beyond Japan. But at their heart, they remained tied to the rhythm of Edo evenings, to the dreamlike spaces where reality softened into image. Not all of the floating world required silk or stagecraft. Sometimes it could be found in the quiet corners of a tea house. Imagine a small room, its ceiling low, its walls of wood darkened by age. Tatami mats cover the floor, their faint scent of straw rising with each step. A kettle simmers quietly on the hearth, steam unfurling in slow ribbons. Guests sit together in calm conversation. Their cups are filled and refilled not in haste, but in the rhythm of pauses. The taste of tea is simple, faintly bitter, grounding. Outside, the sounds of the city drift like distant waves, the cry of a vendor, the laughter of passers-by. But within, time seems to float, measured only by the quiet breath of the kettle. Here, the floating world was not spectacle, but presence, a shared moment, unhurried, slipping past like smoke. For all its color and music, the floating world was always tinged with awareness of its impermanence. The courtesan's beauty faded with years. The kabuki actor's voice grew thin. The lanterns burned low, and the prints themselves yellowed with time. But perhaps it was this impermanence that made the floating world so gentle in its allure. It did not promise eternity. It offered only a moment, framed like a painting, brightened like a lantern in the dark. Visitors knew they could not hold on to it, and so they learned to linger, to notice the tilt of a fan, the hush before a note, the way light falls across a sleeve of silk. Each detail was enough, because each detail would soon be gone. When the night deepened, the floating world slowly dissolved. The lamps were extinguished, one by one. The shamisen fell silent. Streets that had glowed with lanterns returned to shadow. The visitors stepped outside the district's gates, and once again the city became ordinary. The quiet alleys, the sleeping houses, the faint call of the watchman. Yet something lingered. A tune hummed beneath the breath, a print tucked into a sleeve, a memory of silk against lamplight. The floating world could not be held, but it could be carried quietly, like an aftertaste. And in this way, the floating world was not entirely separate from daily life. It was woven into the rhythm of Edo itself, a gentle reminder that even in stillness, there are moments of drifting, of beauty that appears, glimmers, and passes.
The Japan of the Sakoku era was often described as closed to the outside world, sealed like a treasure box. Yet within that sealed space, entire worlds unfolded, quiet, intricate, and endlessly varied. If the samurai held the sword and the farmer tended the rice, the artisan's place was in the workshop, at the hearth, or by the riverside kiln. It was here, in the hidden rhythm of craft, that a different kind of Japan revealed itself, one made not of politics or power, but of touch, patience, and quiet devotion. The morning light entered differently in the dwelling of an artisan. Unlike the farmer's wide fields or the samurai's ordered compound, the craftsman's house often doubled as his place of work. You could smell it even before you entered, the faint tang of wood shavings, the smoky perfume of lacquer, the iron scent of a forge, or the sharp earthy odor of fresh clay.
Inside, the air was thick with stillness, broken only by the soft, steady repetition of a hand at work, the sound of a saw, its teeth biting gently into cedar, the rasp of a plane sliding across the grain of pine, the low, rhythmic tapping of a chisel guided by a calloused hand. These were not rushed sounds. They belonged to an existence measured not in minutes or hours, but in the flow of work from morning until dusk, or in the span of a commission that might take months to finish. In Sakoku, Japan, the village carpenter was not just a tradesman. He was the builder of shrines, of bridges, of the simple homes in which life unfolded. His knowledge was deep, carried not in books, but in memory, gesture, and the body's intimate familiarity with wood. Imagine his workshop, beams of light falling across unfinished planks, a bucket of water to cool the blade of a saw. Every object around him, the tools, the bench, even the way he sat, bore the weight of centuries of repetition and refinement. Not far from the village, in the quiet folds of a hill, the kilns stood waiting. Built into the slope itself, their mouths opened like dark, hungry caverns. The potter's life was one of fire and patience. Clay, drawn from riverbeds or dug from the mountainside, was pounded, kneaded, and shaped by hands that seemed to know instinctively how much water, how much force, how much pause to give. Each vessel began as a lump of earth, formless, heavy, humble, but under the steady rhythm of the potter's wheel, it lengthened and rose, becoming a bowl, a cup, a jar. Watching the process was like watching time itself take shape, slow, steady, inevitable. And then came the firing. The kiln was lit, its flames fed with pine logs through long nights. Families often took turns staying awake to tend the fire, watching the glow seep through cracks in the earth walls. The air filled with the scent of resin, the crackle of wood, and the deep breath of fire-consuming oxygen. When morning came, the kiln was sealed and the long wait began. Inside, the clay changed in ways no human could control. Colors shifted, glazes fused, textures hardened. Days later, the kiln was opened, and the potter would hold in his hands vessels both flawless and flawed, some shining with the deep sheen of ash glaze, others cracked, misshapen, their fate to be discarded or repurposed. In that moment, the artisan bowed not only to his craft, but to chance itself. The fire was both collaborator and rival. Perfection was never guaranteed, and so humility was always part of the work.
In a quieter room, perhaps lit by nothing more than a single oil lamp, the loom stood. Its wooden frame filled much of the space. Threads stretched taut across it in pale lines. The weaver's work was a song of repetition. Feet pressing pedals, hands sliding the shuttle back and forth, the rhythmic clack of wood against wood. On the loom, colors slowly unfolded, indigo blues, soft browns, muted reds, drawn from natural dyes made with plants, bark, and minerals. Each pattern told a story. The geometry of checks, the flow of stripes, the subtle blending of tones. Cloth was never just cloth. It was warmth for winter, modesty for the body, and beauty in the everyday. For many women, weaving was both work and meditation, an inheritance of skill from mothers and grandmothers. The sound of the loom became part of the household's pulse, as steady and essential as the crackle of the cooking fire or the splash of water being drawn from the well. While the loom was gentle, the forge was thunderous. In a dim workshop filled with smoke and sparks, the blacksmith hammered glowing metal upon an anvil. Each blow rang out like a bell, echoing through the village streets. His work ranged from the humble to the exalted. Hoes and sickles for farmers, nails for carpenters, hinges for doors, blades for hunters and warriors. Iron was life itself, transformed by fire and force into tools that shaped survival. The forge glowed day and night, a place where raw ore and human will collided. Sweat poured, arms ached, but the rhythm endured. Heat, strike, quench, repeat. And when the metal cooled, the blacksmith saw not just a tool, but a continuation of an ancient chain, a craft stretching back to the earliest settlements of the archipelago. Even in Sakoku's still world, the blacksmith's hammer connected the present to the past, each spark a fleeting reminder of continuity. Some crafts demanded a different kind of endurance, not strength, but patience, almost beyond imagining. The lacquerer was such an artisan. Lacquer, drawn from the sap of trees, was toxic in its raw state. Handling it required care and respect. Once applied to wood or bamboo, it had to be left to dry in a humid environment, often for weeks at a time. Then another coat, then another. Each layer was polished, smoothed, refined. Some objects required dozens of layers, the process stretching over months or even years. The result was a surface so deep and glossy it seemed to hold light within itself. Bowls, trays, writing boxes, combs, all could become vessels of quiet elegance, their sheen like still water at dusk. But what the observer saw in an instant, the artisan built through countless acts of patience. Every layer was a meditation, every pause a reminder that beauty is often a slow accumulation, not a sudden arrival. Across these varied crafts, carpentry, pottery, weaving, smithing, lacquering, one truth remained. The artisan's hands were more than tools. They were repositories of memory. Knowledge passed down, not through manuals or schools, but through demonstration, correction, and endless practice. A father guiding his son's grip on a chisel. A mother correcting the angle of her daughter's shuttle. A master showing an apprentice how to listen for the right sound when iron cooled in water. In this way, the artisan's hands became living archives. Each callus, each scar, each instinctive movement was part of a lineage stretching backward, quietly preserved in bodies and in gestures. In an age when the outside world was held at bay, Japanese artisans turned inward, refining, perfecting, deepening what already existed.
Isolation did not mean stagnation. It meant a kind of concentration. Pottery styles blossomed. Textile patterns grew more intricate. Woodwork became more precise. Lacquer more refined. To live in that world was to be surrounded not by mass production or imported wares, but by things made close at hand with care and with the quiet rhythm of labor. A wooden bucket, a straw sandal, a lacquered bowl, each object carried not only utility, but a trace of the artisan's patience. For those who used them daily, these objects faded into the fabric of life, unremarkable. In the stillness of Sakoku, Japan, artisans were not celebrated with grandeur or titles. Their names rarely entered official records. Yet their hands shaped the world in which all others lived. To sit in such a workshop, to hear the chisel, the shuttle, the hammer, the hiss of steam, the whisper of brush on lacquer, is to understand that history is not only the story of rulers and warriors, and in that devotion, there is a lesson that still speaks across centuries, that meaning does not always come from speed or spectacle or conquest. Sometimes it is found in the quiet rhythm of work itself. The roads that led to Japan's temples were often narrow, unassuming paths, shaded by tall cedars or low pines, whose branches brushed against one another with a constant whispering sound. In the era of Sakoku, these sacred spaces stood as both sanctuaries and timekeepers of an older rhythm, preserving traditions that had endured for centuries before the shogunate closed the country's gates. For many who lived in villages or towns, the temple was a place where silence could be heard most clearly. The stillness of a temple was not simply the absence of noise. It was a carefully tended quiet, a cultivated atmosphere where every sound, the tapping of a wooden clapper, the strike of a bronze bell, the crunch of sand beneath wooden geta, carried meaning. Stepping into temple grounds, one felt the boundary between the everyday and the eternal, between the concerns of the marketplace and the cycles of nature. Approaching a Buddhist temple or Shinto shrine often began with a gate. These gates, torii of wood or stone, or the heavy two-story sanman of Zen temples, were thresholds. Passing through them was to enter into a space cleansed of ordinary dust. In Edo period Japan, peasants, merchants, samurai, and monks alike moved through these gates with the same small rituals: bowing, clapping hands, or pausing to adjust their pace. Children might tug their parents' sleeves, eager to run ahead, while older villagers slowed, as if to stretch out the quiet that waited inside. Stone lanterns lined the paths, their surfaces weathered by rain and lichen, their hollows sometimes holding a flickering flame when evening ceremonies were prepared. In daylight, they were companions of stillness, mute witnesses to generations of footsteps. The gravel paths crunched underfoot, guiding visitors toward wooden halls. Often, these paths were swept early each morning by temple attendants or monks with long-handled brooms. The act of sweeping was both practical and spiritual, a way of clearing not just leaves and dust, but also the mental clutter that followed people into sacred ground. Sound was central to temple life. The great bronze bells, known as bonsho, were cast with immense care, their deep tones resonating across valleys. In the early morning, a bell might be struck to signal the start of meditation. At dusk, it was rung to mark the closing of the day. The most famous striking occurred on New Year's Eve, when temple bells across Japan were struck 108 times, each toll symbolizing the cleansing of worldly desires. In the Sakoku era, the sound of a temple bell carried across rice fields and forested hills, a reminder to farmers or merchants of the cycles that governed all things. Its vibration was long and low, fading slowly until it seemed to merge with the earth itself. For those listening, it was said to carry a sense of impermanence, a sound that dissolved even as it was born. The monks who tended these spaces lived lives of rhythm and simplicity. Before dawn, many rose to chant sutras, their voices low and steady in the dim halls. The chants were not songs, nor were they speech. They were something between, a measured drone that seemed to echo off wooden beams and fade into incense smoke. Their days moved slowly, shaped by prayer, meditation, and small tasks, gathering firewood, tending gardens, copying texts by hand. In Zen temples, meditation halls were ordered with great precision. Each monk sat on his own cushion, facing the wall, still as stone. The silence was broken only by the soft steps of a supervisor moving behind them, sometimes with a thin stick in hand, ready to correct posture with a light, ritual strike. This was not punishment, but a reminder to remain present. Meals were simple: bowls of rice, pickled vegetables, perhaps a thin soup. These were eaten in silence, with wooden utensils, each gesture prescribed and deliberate. To eat was itself a form of mindfulness. In Sakoku, Japan, monks depended on donations from villagers and townsfolk who brought rice, vegetables, or coins. The bond between temples and communities was reciprocal. The people supported the monks, and in return, the monks offered prayers, guidance, and the preservation of traditions. Though Japan was closed to the outside world, its people were not closed to the idea of journeying. Pilgrimage was one of the few forms of travel permitted under the Tokugawa shogunate. Villagers, merchants, and even samurai might save for months or years to visit famous temples and shrines, Ise Jingu, dedicated to the sun goddess Amaterasu, the great temple at Zenkoji in Nagano, or the temples of Mount Koya, resting place of Kukai, the founder of Shingon Buddhism. Such pilgrimages were not always grand. For many, a simple visit to the local temple during a festival was enough. Children laughed as they ran between lanterns. Women brought offerings of food wrapped carefully in cloth. Men knelt before altars with coins in hand. Incense smoke drifted, curling upward in thin blue ribbons that clung to robes and sleeves. Temples were also places of teaching. In the Sakoku period, many temples ran terakoya, small temple schools where children learned to read, write, and calculate. It was in these modest wooden rooms, often lit by paper windows, that literacy spread quietly among common people. The sound of brushes scratching across paper, the low murmur of a monk guiding a child's hand. These, too, were sounds of the silent temples. One cannot speak of temples without speaking of their gardens. Whether dry rock gardens of raked gravel or mossy courtyards with stone basins and carp-filled ponds, these spaces were extensions of meditation. A rock placed just so, a lantern angled to catch moonlight, a maple tree chosen for the way its leaves burned red in autumn. Each was part of a design meant to awaken awareness. In Zen gardens, sand was raked into waves around stones. patterns that suggested rivers or mountains. Each morning, monks remade these patterns, knowing that wind or footsteps would soon erase them. In this repetition lay a lesson: impermanence, effort, and acceptance. Visitors walked slowly through these gardens, pausing to listen to the drip of water from bamboo spouts into stone basins, or to watch koi glide beneath lily pads. In the stillness of these gardens, time stretched thin, and even the bustle of Edo's crowded streets felt far away. Temples were also keepers of memory. Graveyards clustered beside their halls, rows of stone markers standing silent under moss and falling leaves. Each represented a life, and behind each stood a family who came to light incense, bow, and remember. In the Sakoku era, when communities were tightly bound, these graveyards were places where lineage and continuity were made visible. Funeral rites, too, were central. The steady chanting of sutras, the careful folding of hands, the smoke rising from offerings, these rituals allowed both grief and acceptance to find expression. In silence, loss became part of the wider rhythm of existence. In the silent temples of Sakoku, Japan, the essence of stillness was not the absence of life, but the presence of balance. The sound of a bell fading into the mountains, the pattern of a rake across sand, the chant of monks in low voices. These were not empty silences, but full ones. For the farmers who came to pray before planting, for the merchants who paused before a journey, for the samurai seeking calm between duties, the temples offered a still point in a world that otherwise pulsed with obligation and control. And as the gates of Japan remained closed to the outside, within its own borders, the temples continued to breathe in rhythm with the people, keeping alive a silence that has endured across centuries. The shogunate's policy of Sakoku, the closed country, restricted Japan's contact with the outside world, but it did not silence the hum of commerce within its borders. While ships from distant lands were barred, the pathways of rice, silk, sake, and timber still wove a living web across valleys and seas. To follow the footsteps of a merchant in Edo period Japan was to walk a path of quiet ambition, delicate negotiations, and a patient understanding of cycles that extended far beyond a single season. The merchants of this era were not warriors, nor nobles, nor farmers. They held no swords and carried no title of birth. In the rigid hierarchy of the Tokugawa world, they were placed near the bottom, beneath peasants who grew food and above only the outcast. And yet, in the shadows of this ranking, they became indispensable. Without their ledgers, their warehouses, and their caravans, the world of Sakoku could not have turned. This was their path, at once humble and quietly powerful. The merchant's day began before the sun had yet broken the horizon. In small towns, shutters creaked open as men in cotton robes stepped out into streets still wet with dew. They carried abacuses wrapped in cloth, ink-stained ledgers, or wooden boxes filled with coin. The clop of their geita echoed softly against packed earth roads. Larger cities like Osaka and Edo woke to the shuffle of many such feet. The smell of fish markets near rivers mixed with the smoke of charcoal braziers. Barges loaded with rice sacks drifted under low bridges, their sails furled until wind and tide favored them. Porters bent forward under heavy bundles, chanting in rhythm to pace their steps. The streets filled gradually, but the merchants' work had often begun hours earlier, in the quiet balance of numbers. By lamplight, accounts were checked, debts recalled, and goods measured. The merchant's path was not guided by sword or law, but by trust, precision, and the steady memory of trade. At the heart of this path lay Osaka, often called the nation's kitchen. From every corner of Japan, rice flowed into its warehouses. The white grains, carried in straw sacks, were more than food. They were currency. Samurai stipends were paid not in coins, but in rice, and the wealth of entire domains was measured in koku, the unit that marked how much rice could feed a man for a year. Within Osaka's Dojima rice exchange, merchants gathered under wooden eaves, trading not only sacks of grain, but also rights and futures. It was here that the early roots of futures trading quietly took hold, as men bought and sold rice not yet harvested, relying on trust and prediction. The clatter of abacuses, the murmur of agreements, the scratching of brushes across paper, these were the sounds of a marketplace that shaped the flow of the entire country. In the warehouses, rows upon rows of straw-wrapped sacks leaned against one another like sleeping bodies. Dust hung in the beams of light that pierced through narrow windows. Porters moved endlessly, shoulders straining under the weight, their chants marking both effort and solidarity. Above it all, the merchant watched, calculating not just profit, but survival. For a poor season or a sudden flood could alter the worth of every grain. If Osaka was the kitchen, Edo was the table. The city, swollen to over 1 million inhabitants, demanded endless streams of food, cloth, wood, and entertainment. Merchants walked its streets with careful steps, for here their fortunes could rise quickly and collapse just as swiftly. Rows of shops stretched out along bustling districts. Drapers unrolled bolts of dyed cotton. Fishmongers laid out gleaming rows of sardines and mackerel on wooden boards wet with melted ice. Peddlers called out wares, balancing poles across their shoulders with baskets swaying on either side. Yet not all trade was so visible. Behind sliding doors and narrow rooms lit by single oil lamps, negotiations were made in whispers. A tea dealer promised to deliver his best leaves by the next harvest. A bookseller counted coins, deciding whether to risk reprinting a controversial woodblock. The merchant's path was one of calculation. But calculation wrapped in courtesy, patience, and the endless ritual of bows and folded hands. Trade was not confined to cities. Across the countryside, narrow roads stretched between villages and castle towns. Merchants traveled in groups for safety, their sandals kicking dust into the air as they carried goods on poles, led pack horses, or rolled carts with iron wheels that groaned against stone. The Tokugawa shogunate maintained the great Gokaido, the 5 highways that connected Edo with the rest of the land. On these roads, merchants passed daimyo processions, long trains of armored retainers, banners snapping in the wind, lacquered boxes carried on shoulders. For the merchant, such a procession was both spectacle and obstacle. The roads were cleared for samurai lords. Commoners had to kneel until they passed. Still, when the banners faded into distance, the path returned to the merchants. They stopped at inns, their ledgers and goods resting on tatami floors, sipping warm sake as they exchanged news. One spoke of poor harvests in the north, another of rising demand for lacquerware in Kyoto. Such talk traveled with them, carried from one end of Japan to another, stitching together distant regions into a living map of trade. For all their wealth,
Merchants carried the burden of their rank. In the Confucian hierarchy upheld by the shogunate, they were deemed less virtuous than farmers who fed the people, or warriors who defended the realm. And yet, in the silence of their counting houses, merchants shaped power as surely as swords did on the battlefield. Some clans and daimyo grew quietly indebted to merchants, borrowing to fund projects or cover lean years. A careful merchant never flaunted this influence. Their houses were often plain on the outside, their wealth concealed behind sliding screens. Modesty was not only virtue, it was survival. To appear too rich was to invite suspicion, or worse, taxation. Yet, within those walls, treasures could be found. Chinese porcelain brought through Nagasaki's narrow gates, silk from Kyoto's workshops, incense carved from rare woods. A guest, if trusted enough to see, might glimpse shelves lined with scrolls or lacquer boxes painted with gold. The path of merchants also wound into the floating world, the pleasure quarters of cities like Edo's Yoshiwara or Kyoto's Gion. Here, coin flowed as freely as sake, and merchants became patrons of kabuki theaters, tea houses, and courtesans. Though scorned in public ranks, merchants were often the lifeblood of these places. They sponsored actors, purchased extravagant kimonos for favored courtesans, and commissioned woodblock prints that captured fleeting moments of beauty. The floating world was ephemeral, but commerce gave it form, and in turn, it gave the merchants something rare: acknowledgement. In these quarters, a man was not measured by his samurai lineage, but by his taste, his generosity, and his ability to keep the flow of coin alive. Yet the merchant's path was never without danger. Fires swept through crowded districts with terrible frequency, consuming entire warehouses in hours. Floods washed away barges and crops alike. A sudden edict from the shogunate might forbid certain luxuries, leaving traders with unsellable goods. Even trust, the invisible coin of commerce, could falter. A partner might default. A debtor might vanish. The abacus beads could shift in a single night from profit to ruin. For this reason, many merchants placed their faith not only in their ledgers but also in small household altars, offering incense to protective deities of fortune and commerce. Despite their low station, merchants carried quiet power. It was their rice that fed samurai stipends, their timber that built castles, their fabrics that clothed courtiers, their paper that carried official decrees. In the silence of their exchanges, they underpinned the very order that ranked them so low. Walking their path required patience, the patience to accept invisibility, the patience to endure disdain, and the patience to build wealth, not in sudden conquest, but in the steady drip of coin and grain. And in the closed country of Sakoku, Japan, where the outside world was kept at bay, it was the merchants who wove the inside together. Their footsteps, quiet but countless, left a path that endures still. In the rhythms of trade, the shapes of cities, and the unspoken truth that even in silence, commerce finds its way. Beyond the wide avenues of Edo, past the crowded merchant streets and the tiled gates of temples, there lay another world, one quieter, one enclosed. It was the world of courtyards, walled gardens, and inner spaces, tucked away behind sliding doors invisible to the busy traveler on the road. The Japan of the Sakoku era
is often remembered for its outward restrictions, its great seclusion from foreign contact. But just as striking were the inward landscapes, the spaces designed not for display, but for retreat. These hidden courtyards were not merely architectural features, they were stages for the daily rhythms of family life, sanctuaries of contemplation, and small worlds unto themselves, each with its own weather, its own light, and its own silences. To step into a courtyard was to pass through thresholds. From the bustling street, one entered a low gate, perhaps marked with a family crest, and found oneself in a narrow alley of packed earth. Sliding open the wooden door of the house revealed interiors, softened with tatami and paper screens. It was a paradoxical space, open to the sky, yet enclosed on all sides, a pocket of nature framed by wood and tile. Some were no larger than a few paces across a patch of moss, a stone basin, a single pine. Others stretched wide with paths of stepping stones, miniature bridges over trickling water, lanterns standing watch beside manicured shrubs. The walls that enclosed these gardens were more than physical boundaries. They were symbols of separation, protecting the quiet inside from the gaze and noise outside. Within the courtyard, one felt the shift of the seasons more intimately. The first plum blossoms in February, the drifting maple leaves in autumn, the hush of snow as it gathered on rocks. For many households, the courtyard was not simply ornamental. It was a stage upon which life unfolded. In the mornings, children might chase each other around stepping stones, their laughter echoing against the walls. Women rinsed vegetables in the stone basin or hung laundry where sunlight pooled across the paving. At noon, an old grandfather might sit beneath the eaves, pipe in hand, watching the shadows change. His gaze would settle not on the horizon, but on the small world before him, the water rippling in a jar, the wings of a dragonfly as it hovered over the moss. Meals, too, were often arranged to face the garden. A tray of rice and pickles set upon tatami tasted different when accompanied by the sight of pine branches or the soft murmur of water. In this way, the courtyard was woven into the very rhythm of nourishment. At night, lanterns were lit, their glow reflecting faintly on the leaves. Families gathered close, their voices hushed, as if the garden itself required a certain gentleness. Beyond the walls, the city of Edo might roar with festival drums or the clang of blacksmiths, but here, within these boundaries, life moved at another tempo, slower, quieter, inward-looking. The courtyards were not random patches of green. They were composed with deliberate care, drawing upon centuries of gardening traditions. Stones were not simply placed, they were arranged to suggest mountains, islands, or pathways. A lantern might stand to balance the weight of a pine. A trickle of water might be designed to sound like distant rain, softening the silence. These gardens carried meanings, both practical and spiritual. For households with samurai ties, a single pine could represent endurance and loyalty. For artisans, a flowering plum might be a wish for renewal and creativity. Merchants sometimes planted bamboo, whose hollow stems whispered with the wind, reminding them of resilience and adaptability. The act of tending a courtyard was as much a meditation as a chore. Raking gravel into ripples, trimming a branch just so, sweeping fallen leaves, each task was performed slowly, carefully, as if aligning not just the garden, but the mind of the one tending it. In spring, courtyards transformed with bursts of color. Cherry blossoms, though fleeting, painted the sky above pale walls with their drifting petals. Families spread mats beneath them, even within these small spaces, savoring the brief rain of flowers. Summer brought cicadas, their chorus filling even the smallest courtyard with sound. Shadows deepened under the eaves, and families sought relief from the heat by pouring cool water over the stones, letting it evaporate into the air. Lanterns glowed longer into the night, catching the wings of moths. In autumn, maples turned red and gold, their leaves scattering across moss. Courtyards became canvases of fire and earth, a reminder of impermanence. Winter covered stones with frost, then with snow. Bamboo bent under the weight of white drifts, and the sound of a broom sweeping the path became a daily ritual. In these cold months, the courtyard reminded its dwellers of stillness, of beauty, even in the season of scarcity. Some courtyards were shaped for more than daily living. They became settings for tea gatherings, where a few guests, carefully chosen, entered by narrow pathways, leaving behind the outside world. The garden itself prepared them, slowing their steps, lowering their voices, guiding them toward the small tea hut. Within this frame, even the smallest courtyard could become a world of ritual, stones washed by rain, a basin filled with clear water, a branch arranged to catch the moonlight. Each detail contributed to the mood of simplicity and attentiveness. For families not steeped in tea ceremony, the courtyard still held a sense of occasion. On festival nights, lanterns were hung from branches, their light swaying in the evening breeze. Children set paper boats afloat in shallow pools, candles flickering as they drifted. These moments stitched memory into space, making the courtyard a vessel of family stories. The hidden courtyards, though small, were places of education. Children learned the patience of watching insects, the cycles of growth and decay. They learned how to care for plants, how to observe without disturbing. For adults, too, the gardens were teachers. The moss that thrived in shadow spoke of endurance. The falling leaf spoke of impermanence. The stone unmoved through seasons spoke of constancy. In these courtyards, the lessons of life were present not as doctrines but as quiet presences, available to anyone who looked closely. In a world that had closed itself from outside contact, these courtyards were like mirrors of the nation itself, bounded, enclosed, inward turning. Yet within those walls there was richness, variety, and depth. To the passer-by, they might have seemed hidden, but to those who lived with them, they were worlds in miniature, places where life slowed, where silence deepened, and where beauty unfolded in small, patient gestures. To remember Sakoku is not only to recall the great gates of Nagasaki or the edicts of the shogunate. It is also to remember these hidden courtyards where families lived and breathed, where the seasons played out in intimate scale, and where the lessons of stillness were learned not in words, but in the quiet of moss, water, stone, and sky. When the sun dipped low behind the tiled rooftops of Edo, and the heat of the day gave way to the cool breath of evening, a new kind of life awakened in the streets. It was the season of festivals, and with them came the lanterns. Paper and flame, light and shadow, together they transformed the familiar into the dreamlike. Bridges glowed, rivers shimmered, alleys that by day were narrow and gray became paths of gold. The lantern festivals were not merely events of amusement. They were rituals of light in a world bounded by darkness, symbols of hope and fleeting joy in an age where silence and restriction often pressed close. For a Japan that had closed itself to the world, the lantern was paradoxically both humble and luminous, a vessel made of fragile paper and bamboo, yet one that carried the spirit of renewal and community. Long before the festival night, preparations began. In workshops tucked away behind busy merchant streets, artisans bent over bamboo ribs, tying them with thin cords, stretching translucent paper across their frames. Some lanterns were small, meant to be carried by hand, glowing softly like fireflies. Others were grand, painted with bold colors, decorated with dragons, cranes, or swirling waves. Children crowded around these stalls, watching as brushes swept across the paper, leaving behind scenes of mountains, temples, or even playful cats. For many families, buying a lantern was as much a ritual as the festival itself. Fathers haggled with merchants, mothers examined the paper's smoothness, and children tugged at their sleeves, eager to choose one bright enough to outshine the rest. When evening came, households lit their lanterns one by one. The father's flint sparked against steel, catching kindling until the flame settled within the paper walls. The lantern trembled in the child's hand, its light flickering across the cheeks of those who watched. With that first glow, anticipation grew. The festival had begun. The streets of Edo, often shadowed by day beneath their heavy wooden eaves, now unfurled into rivers of light. Lanterns hung from poles above shop fronts, each swaying gently in the night breeze. Lines of them stretched down entire avenues, turning the city into a glowing corridor. Merchants took pride in their displays. One sake shop might hang lanterns painted with rolling waves, another with the smiling face of Ebisu, god of prosperity. Even the most modest stall selling pickles or sweets would hang a paper lamp, its gentle light drawing customers closer. Children darted between the crowds, their own small lanterns swinging like fireflies in motion. Couples strolled slowly, the glow tracing their faces. From high balconies, old men leaned to watch, their expressions softening in the amber light. The city itself seemed changed, softened. The sharp lines of tile and timber blurred under the glow, replaced with curves of shadow, glimmers of warmth. For a few nights each year, Edo was no longer simply a capital of rules and duties, but a lantern-lit stage for wonder. Perhaps the most magical moment came when lanterns were set afloat upon rivers and ponds. Families gathered by the Sumida River, hands shielding flames from the breeze, before lowering their lanterns gently to the water's surface. The current carried them downstream, hundreds of lights drifting together, scattering reflections across the rippling dark. To watch them was to feel time itself stretch and slow. The city's noise faded, leaving only the murmur of water, the hiss of wind through reeds, the occasional call of a boatman. Each floating lantern carried a wish. Some were prayers for ancestors, guiding their spirits safely. Others were hopes for children, for good harvests, for peace in the household. The act was both personal and collective, one flame among many, yet all moving together down the same river. To stand at the riverbank and watch them go was to glimpse something beyond the self, the shared yearning of a community, glowing fragile but bright against the vast dark. The lanterns were not alone. Their glow mingled with the music of the night. From distant stages, the sharp beat of taiko drums carried across the air, their rhythm steady as a heartbeat. Flutes trilled above them, light and playful. Sometimes dancers passed through the crowd, their steps measured, sleeves wide, their shadows stretching across the ground in the lantern light. Vendors called out, selling grilled fish, steaming rice cakes, skewers of sweet dango. The smoke of cooking mingled with the scent of pine torches and incense, filling the streets with a fragrance both earthly and sacred. Laughter echoed, children chasing each other with lanterns, young men boasting, old women gossiping in hushed voices. Yet, beneath the sound was always the soft, steady hum of light. Flames trembling within their fragile shells, reminding all that joy itself was as fleeting and delicate as the paper lantern.
To an outsider, the Lantern Festival might have seemed simple, a celebration of light, a diversion from daily life. But to those who lived in Sakoku, Japan, it carried deeper meaning. Lanterns symbolized guidance. They were lights for travelers, lights for spirits, lights for families finding their way through darkness. In a world closed to foreign trade, where uncertainty lingered at the edges of the nation, the glow of lanterns affirmed continuity and belonging. They were also reminders of impermanence. The flame could be snuffed by a careless breeze, the paper torn by a stray hand. Yet it was this fragility that gave the light its poignancy. To carry a lantern was to acknowledge the delicate beauty of life, glowing for a time, then gone. Beyond the grand displays, there was an intimacy to the lanterns. In small alleys, families hung a single lamp above their gate, its glow soft against the wood. A lone traveler carried one at the end of his staff, the circle of light his only companion. In temples, monks placed rows of plain white lanterns, their stillness a prayer more eloquent than words. For lovers, the Lantern Festival was a chance to walk side by side in the forgiving light. Shadows softened flaws, eyes glimmered with reflected fire, and words came more easily beneath the glow. For parents, it was a time to hold their children's hands, watching their faces alight with wonder. For elders, it was a moment to see their city transformed, to remember their own childhood festivals, and to pass on stories as the lanterns passed down the river. As midnight neared, the lanterns began to thin. Flames flickered low, some paper shells already blackened by smoke. Vendors packed their stalls, sweeping ash from the streets. Families turned homeward, their lanterns guttering but still glowing faintly. At the river, only a few lights remained, drifting far downstream until they blurred into stars reflected on water. The festival ended, not with sudden silence, but with a gradual dimming like a breath released. Yet the memory of it lingered. Even after the lanterns had burned out, their glow remained in the eyes of those who had seen them. The streets seemed darker in the days that followed, but perhaps because the memory of light still haunted them. In the time of seclusion, when Japan guarded its borders and turned inward, the lantern festivals were reminders that even within walls, light could flourish. They revealed a truth, that joy need not be vast to be profound, that a small flame could illuminate more than its paper shell. The lantern was a fragile thing, bamboo, paper, fire. But in the hands of a child, on the waters of a river, in the streets of a guarded city, it became a symbol of resilience, of community, and of the beauty that flickers even in fleeting moments. To walk through Edo on a lantern night was to walk through a dream, one painted not with permanence, but with glow and shadow. And perhaps that is why they are remembered still.
as nights when the world, however briefly, seemed both infinite and intimate, as bright as the flame within a single lantern.
When the last lanterns of the festival had guttered, when the streets emptied of their laughter and music, the city did not fall silent. It shifted into another rhythm, slower, quieter, but no less vital. For in the deep hours, when most slept behind their sliding doors, Edo belonged to the night watchmen. Their work was not glamorous, it was not celebrated in poems or painted in elegant screens, yet without them, the city's great wooden expanse, its crowded houses, its temples, its bustling merchant rows, would have been vulnerable to the smallest spark, the quietest theft, the creeping dangers of the dark.
Edo was a city of timber. Its houses, its inns, its palaces, even its great bridges, all were built from wood, lacquered or unvarnished, sometimes thatched, sometimes tiled. Fire was its constant enemy. A careless ember, a fallen lamp, a cooking pot left too long could become catastrophe. So the midnight watchmen carried not only lanterns, but the weight of vigilance. Their ears were trained to the faintest crackle, their eyes to the shifting patterns of smoke. At every hour, they paced the alleys, striking their clappers, hyoshigi, wooden blocks that made a sharp, echoing sound. Gene, Gene. The sound was both warning and reassurance. To the sleeping citizen, it meant, "We are awake, you may rest." To the lurking thief, it meant, "You are seen. Stay in shadow no longer."
The watchmen were not samurai. Most were drawn from townsmen or laborers, men hardened by daily toil. Their clothes were practical, short coats, tied trousers, straw sandals. A sash at the waist held small tools, a pipe for smoke, a length of rope, sometimes a short staff. Above all, they carried their lantern and their clappers. In groups of 2 or 3, they walked the districts assigned to them, keeping the same paths night after night until the rhythm of their steps was as familiar as breathing. Some took pride in their sharp eyes, others in their booming voices as they called the hour. A few were known to linger, pausing to chat with innkeepers or sip tea at late-night stalls. Yet even in these pauses their role remained, steady presences in a city that could not afford to sleep entirely.
When fire came, the night watchmen were first to act. The alarm did not rise with words, but with sound. The moment smoke was seen, the clappers were struck again and again, faster, sharper, the noise carrying across rooftops. From temples, bells tolled. From high wooden towers, Hinomeyagura, fire lookout towers, drums beat in urgency. The city moved as one organism against the blaze. Buckets were filled, roofs wetted, valuables carried out. Fire brigades, organized by neighborhood, rushed with ladders and hooks. But it was the night watchman whose first cries had given the city its chance. Many tales were told of watchmen who lost their lives in the flames, men who had refused to retreat until the last house was emptied, or who climbed onto burning rooftops to call the alarm wider. They were seldom remembered in grand records, but in the quiet gratitude of families who still had homes to sleep in.
Yet fire was not the only danger. The night also belonged to thieves. In Edo, burglary was a constant threat. The narrow alleys, the paper walls, the crowded markets provided countless opportunities. Thieves moved like cats, slipping into homes through unlatched shutters, cutting purses in the dark. Here, too, the night watchmen played their part. Their clappers broke the silence, scattering those who lurked. Their lanterns pierced shadows. They knew the faces of their neighborhoods, the steps of the honest worker, and the hesitations of the suspicious stranger. Sometimes there were confrontations, a chase through alleys, a scuffle beneath eaves. Yet more often it was the sound itself, the simple rhythm of the clappers, that kept danger at bay. The city knew the night was not empty. Someone watched.
To follow the night watchman was to move with the passing hours. At the start of the night, when shutters were just closing and the smell of cooking fires still lingered, the steps were light. Children leaned sleepily against their mothers, hearing the distant clack before drifting into dreams. By midnight, the city was hushed. The moon hung high, dogs lay curled in alleys, and even the inns were quiet. This was the loneliest time, when the watchmen's voices echoed loudest, and their lanterns seemed most fragile against the vast dark. In the hours before dawn, a faint stirring returned. Bakers rose to prepare dough. Fishermen set out toward the bay. Vendors rolled their carts to the market. The watchmen's rounds ended here, in the liminal hour when night gave way to day, when their lanterns flickered out as the sky paled.
Though their duty was serious, the watchmen were not without companionship. Some carried small flutes, piping soft tunes to pass the lonely hours. Others spoke in low voices, sharing stories of their youth, their families, their frustrations with the city officials who paid little heed to their work. On festival nights, when drunken revelers staggered through the streets, the watchmen laughed among themselves, steering them homeward like shepherds with sheep. They were, in their own way, philosophers of the night. Few men knew Edo as they did, not the bright avenues by day, but the secret heart that stirred after dark. They saw lovers' meetings whispered at gates, beggars curled beneath bridges, foxes darting across temple courtyards. The city revealed itself to them in fragments, fleeting, half-hidden. It was a thankless duty, often invisible. By morning, the city bustled as though nothing had happened. Shopkeepers unbarred their doors. Children ran to lessons. Officials carried on their work. Few thought of the watchmen who had walked the hours, who had kept flame and thief at bay. And yet, without them, Edo could not have endured. Their labor was like the lanterns of the festival, small, fragile, often overlooked, but essential to holding back the darkness. In this sense, the midnight watchman embodied something deep within the spirit of Sakoku, Japan, the quiet discipline of protection, the unseen work that preserved the fragile balance of a closed yet vibrant world. As the first light of dawn crept over tiled rooftops, the watchmen returned their clappers to their belts. Their lanterns dimmed, their steps slowed, their duty done. They faded back into the city's fabric, their names rarely recorded, their faces seldom remembered. But the sound of the clappers lingered, chee, chee, an echo across wood and tile, a heartbeat against silence. To live in Edo was to sleep within that sound, to rest knowing that somewhere in the dark a watchman walked. Not a hero of legend, not a figure of grandeur, but a man with lantern and blocks of wood, guarding the fragile flame of the city through its most vulnerable hours. And in that simple, steady act, there was something timeless. The truth that even in the deepest night, there are always those who keep the watch. Now our journey draws to an end. We have walked through courtyards where shadows lingered, sat beneath lanterns swaying in the night, and followed the footsteps of men whose names history has not kept. The gates of Japan remained closed for more than 2 centuries, from 1639 to 1853. The world beyond was only a rumor, drifting on foreign sails glimpsed from the shore. And yet, within these boundaries, life unfolded in infinite detail. Every courtyard, every temple bell, every street of Edo carried a world within itself. To some, Sakoku was a cage. To others, it was a sanctuary. But to those who lived it day by day, it was simply life. The warmth of a festival lantern, the discipline of stillness, the endless cycle of dawn and dusk.
And though the gates would one day open, and the tides of change would sweep across these islands, the echoes of this time remain. They linger in temples that still stand, in gardens still raked each morning, in the quiet rhythm of festivals that return with each passing year. Perhaps that is the lesson of Sakoku, that even in silence life flourishes, that even in stillness stories unfold, and that sometimes the truest way to know a world is not by watching it expand outward, but by listening to the quiet that breathes within. So now, as the last clappers of the midnight watchmen fade, and the dawn once more paints the rooftops of Edo, we leave this world behind. But the silence lingers, like a lantern's glow carried in memory. And perhaps, if you close your eyes, you can still hear it. Chi, chi, the sound of a city kept safe in the night.